Thank you for joining me, Matilda. I've heard you've recently published a book. Can you tell me what it's called?
Yeah, it's called Relating to People Living with Dementia as Equals.
Okay, fantastic. So I can gather from the title it's about dementia and the kind of status of people with dementia in our society. Can you say a bit more about the argument and what you were trying to show?
Yeah, so what I was interested in was thinking about dementia as a social and political issue. So there's an awful lot of work that's been done on, of course, the kind of neurobiology, the neuroscience of dementia. There's work that's been done on dementia as a health issue, as a public health issue. But I felt that there was a kind of gap, especially in the philosophical literature, around thinking about people living with dementia and their entitlements as members of our society, and whether or not we're complying with our obligations towards them in the way we deliver social care, in the way we structure care services, in the way we structure our communities more broadly. So I wanted to bring this kind of relational egalitarian point of view, which is the point of view that says what matters for equality is that we relate to one another as equals. I wanted to kind of apply this to the social and political position of people living with dementia, to see whether we are relating to people living with dementia as equals, and what we can do about it if we're not, and we are not.
Okay, so can you maybe say a little bit more about the ways in which we're not relating to people with dementia as equals?
Yeah, so quite a lot of the work I do in the book is inspired by my time working as a carer for members of this group, which I did sort of over about 10 years, mostly part-time while supporting my studies, but then a few years where it was my full-time job. And it was a kind of eye-opening experience to be in that role, and to realize just how much sort of discretionary power you have as a carer that's given to you, at the same time as you are restrained by the norms of social care practices, such that you can only really use that discretionary power in sort of at best suboptimal and at worst kind of actively oppressive ways. You're put in positions where you only have about 15 minutes to rush someone through a care intervention. And one of the things I say in the book is that I think people living with dementia, for all sorts of reasons to do with the etiology of the condition, have a general interest in being free to try to meet their own vital needs, if they're able to do so. That interest is not really respected in care services because it takes a long time to sort of indirectly encourage somebody, remind them, shape their environment so that they're more likely to be able to get through that task, to meet that need. It takes much too much time in a system where we prioritize kind of speed and efficiency and getting things done quickly. So quite a lot of what I'm talking about is in social care, but I also am interested in substitute decision making. And I'm also interested in representations of people living with dementia in the media and in sort of society more broadly.
So would it be fair to say we need to kind of change all of those aspects to kind of allow people living with dementia to relate as equals with other people in society and their caregivers, or are there certain aspects that are kind of more important than others?
I mean, I think the thing that we need to address kind of most urgently is the care aspect of all of this, right? So all people living with dementia are going to interact with social care services, should they live long enough to need them. And we just haven't set them up in a way in which we can have kind of equal relations. So these are the kind of most pressing injustices if we want to think about priority. But I think these flow from some broader kind of social structures, some broader social images we have of dementia, some misconceptions we have about what dementia is. People tend to think that there's only one kind of thing called dementia. There's only one way it presents. They have a kind of stereotype in their minds. People tend to adhere to what's been called by some dementia self-advocates a kind of loss of self narrative. So this idea that the kind of key diagnostic feature of dementia is that you lose your identity over time. And there are also kind of broader social injustices in the way we think about disabled people, people with cognitive disabilities, that I think are contributing to this sort of disregard and neglect.
Okay. So the book, I'm assuming, is doing a lot of work to try and sort of diagnose these problems. Mm-hmm. Do you have an account of how they might be solved?
Well, I have some suggestions. So, when I think about care, the main argument I make is about a change in approach in dementia care. When I say a change in approach, I don't mean that people aren't doing this stuff already, but what I mean is there's less of an emphasis on this, right? This is kind of what happens in care services where people are well-staffed enough or well-trained enough to engage in these kind of practices. So I'm interested in what I call indirect first strategies. This is related to this interest that I said that people living with dementia have in being able to meet their own vital needs, should they be able to do so. There's also some really interesting, both kind of anecdotal evidence, but also kind of hard scientific research that shows that the ability of people living with dementia to exercise their functional capacities is highly dependent on the environment around them. And quite often you'll find, working in a care service, that the impediments towards people being able to meet their own needs are not internal impediments, they're external impediments. It's because an environment is extremely noisy and it's causing disorientation. It's because we aren't making use of the tools we have to structure and design bedrooms to be more kind of welcoming and accommodating and friendly. We aren't trying to interpret the sorts of things that the people we're caring for say that sound like they're kind of based on misconceptions, right? This is a kind of classic thing. I call it in the book kind of elements of parallel subjectivity. So, someone with dementia expresses a belief that, as far as we know, it's not true, or it's based on a kind of misunderstanding of the situation. But what you often find is those statements are kind of expressing genuine needs through the tools that the person has. So these kind of indirect strategies, these interpretive strategies, these environment shaping strategies, what I argue in the book is that these kind of have the best prospects of allowing us to constrain power relations over people living with dementia and allow them to make use of their agency.
I mean, can you say a little bit more about some of the kind of philosophical influences here? So you talked about relational equality. I'm hearing sort of notes of sort of non-domination.
Yeah.
I'm hearing things on sort of non-ideal theories of consent and so on. So some of our readers may be familiar with these other aspects of philosophy, but not necessarily with dementia care. So can you say a little bit more about those influences?
Yeah, so I think, I say in the book, I'm taking what I take to be a standard relational egalitarian approach, which is an approach that says we need to identify these kind of paradigm instances of intolerable inequalities, relational inequalities wherever they arise, and do our best to ameliorate them. And domination is kind of a key relational inequality that relational egalitarians want to oppose. I'm also interested in oppression. So I have a chapter in the book where I make the claim and justify the claim that people living with dementia should be thought of as an oppressed social group. And I'm using kind of Iris Marion Young's model of oppression there. And actually one of the things I argue is that they're sort of almost unique among oppressed social groups in that all 5 faces of Iris Marion Young's account seem to apply here. So powerlessness, exploitation, cultural imperialism, marginalization, violence. You can see this, kind of throughout the way we treat members of this group in society. Okay.
And for people listening to this, kind of worrying about what you're saying, is there anything that they can do, any kind of advocacy, campaigning, practical steps that people can take to try and raise this as an issue and address it?
That is a good question. So I think, one of the things I say in the book is that here in the UK, we have kind of the right components for institutionally and legally supporting the social equality of people living with dementia. But there are all these strange ambiguities or like ways in which the institutions and the laws don't connect up that mean that their status is kind of uncertain under the law. So, if I were to prioritize a political campaign around dementia, I think one of the most important things would be to kind of clarify the status of members of this group under the Equality Act, because it's not clear that dementia automatically counts as a disability under the Equality Act. Now, it seems like it probably should, but all the while that remains a kind of ambiguity that needs to be worked out in case law, you'll find that, for instance, people with the early stages of dementia in the workplace will be reluctant to disclose that because obviously there is all this prejudice and this bias. People worry about losing their jobs, but also, going through an employment tribunal is a really difficult thing to do. So trying to clarify this, through legislation rather than through judicial interpretation, I think would be really important. In terms of what you can do at a community level, there are lots of great charities that support people living with dementia, the Alzheimer's Society, but there are also charities that people don't necessarily know so much about that work on providing the tools for self-advocacy for this group. So Alzheimer's Disease International is a really important group there, and so is the Dementia Alliance International. So, what happens sometimes in these charities and in these political movements is we kind of reinforce the idea that people living with this condition sort of universally lack insight into their own lives by having people who don't live with the condition advocating on their behalf and speaking on their behalf. What I think these self-advocacy organizations or these self-advocacy support organizations do really well is they try to center the voice of those living with the condition and try to kind of develop vehicles for political agency. So I think getting involved in those is really important too.
Okay, brilliant. And can I ask you as a final question?
Yeah.
So it's great that you've had this book published recently. Is this part of a sort of an ongoing project for you, or is this a kind of self-contained piece of work? How do you see it fitting in with what you're doing next?
Thanks. That's a really helpful question for me. So I kind of think of this as the first phase in a broader project looking at social care. So I think what's really interesting about social care is it's something that we tend to agree is in crisis across the political spectrum. People tend to have very strong views about social care. But when you really kind of drill down into what people think social care is and why people and what the purpose of having it is, you find that it's all kind of really vague. And I find that really interesting as a scholar, but I think it's also interesting kind of from a political point of view, which is there's kind of no other sphere of public life that's sort of so prominent yet so ill-defined. And I think a lot of the reasons why we're struggling to tackle the social care crisis and kind of reform social care to become the service that its users deserve is that I just don't think we've agreed on what the point of it is. So kind of that's what I'm focusing on right now, is making this political argument about what social care is, from which a series of recommendations about how it ought to be reformed ought to follow.
Well, I look forward to seeing those. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.